I'm standing here today at Dartmouth College, where I've spent the last 28 years teaching international relations and studying the work of Professor John Mearsheimer, one of the most prescient and controversial voices in American political science. My name is Thomas Miller, and I specialize in realist theory and great power competition, with particular focus on how Mearsheimer's predictions about NATO expansion, the rise of China, and the inevitable return to multipolarity have materialized exactly as he warned they would. What you're about to hear isn't comfortable for many Americans to process, but comfort has never been the currency of truth in international relations. Power is, and understanding power dynamics is how we navigate the treacherous waters ahead. Before we go further, I need you to stay with me until the very end of this documentary, because what I'm about to lay out requires the full context to understand the magnitude of the geopolitical shift we're witnessing. The fall of American dominance isn't a headline, it's a process decades in the making, and only by examining the complete arc can you grasp why allies from Seoul to Berlin are hedging their bets, why the global South is building institutions without Washington, and why Mearsheimer's offensive realism has transformed from academic theory to operational reality. When we're done, I want you to comment below and tell me where you're watching from, your city and country. Because this isn't just America's story anymore, it's a global reckoning that touches every corner of the planet. The question nobody in Washington wanted to ask in 1991 was the simplest and most important one. What happens when you're the only superpower left standing? When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down, American policymakers didn't see an opportunity for restraint. They saw a blank canvas for remaking the world in their image. Francis Fukuyama published his famous essay, The End of History, arguing that liberal democracy had won the ideological contest permanently, that humanity had reached the endpoint of its political evolution, and that the future would be one of gradual global convergence around American values. The Pentagon controlled military bases in more than 150 countries, representing hundreds of billions of dollars in annual defense spending that dwarfed any potential rival. The dollar dominated global finance. American corporations led the technology revolution, and Hollywood shaped cultural narratives from Buenos Aires to Bangkok. This was the unipolar moment, and Washington believed it would last forever. I remember reading Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics when it was published in 2001, sitting in my office overlooking the green, thinking about how radically his offensive realism diverged from everything the foreign policy establishment was saying. While pundits celebrated the indispensable nation and the liberal international order, Mearsheimer was writing that the unipolar moment was an anomaly, not a new era. His core argument rested on 5 structural facts about international relations that don't change regardless of who sits in the White House or what ideology dominates policy circles. First, the international system is anarchic. There's no world government above sovereign states to enforce rules or protect the weak. Second, all great powers possess some offensive military capability, meaning they can potentially harm each other. Third, states can never be certain about other states' intentions because leaders change, circumstances shift, and today's friend can become tomorrow's adversary. Fourth, survival is the primary goal of every state because without survival, nothing else matters. Fifth, states think strategically about how to maximize their power and security in this uncertain environment. What made Mearsheimer's offensive realism so controversial wasn't just that it rejected liberal optimism. It was that it predicted specific outcomes that contradicted what Washington wanted to believe. He argued that in an anarchic system where survival depends on power, states don't seek just enough power to be secure. They seek hegemony in their region because that's the only way to guarantee safety. The United States achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by the early 20th century, ejecting European powers and establishing the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially declared that no external great power would be permitted to dominate the Americas. This cost billions in military expenditures over decades, from the Spanish-American War to interventions throughout Latin America. But it gave Washington something invaluable: the security to project power globally without worrying about threats near home. Mearsheimer's insight was that other great powers, China, Russia, regional aspirants, would pursue the same logic. They would seek to dominate their neighborhoods and prevent the United States from maintaining bases, alliances, and influence in their backyards. The tragedy of great power politics is that even when states have benign intentions, the structure of international anarchy creates security dilemmas that lead to conflict. When NATO began expanding eastward in the late 1990s, absorbing Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, American officials genuinely believed they were spreading stability and democracy. But from Moscow's perspective, this looked like encirclement, a hostile military alliance moving hundreds of miles closer to Russian borders, backed by a defense budget that exceeded $400 billion annually, while Russia struggled with an economy smaller than Italy's. Mearsheimer warned in the 1990s that NATO expansion would be seen as an existential threat by any Russian government, regardless of whether it was democratic or authoritarian, because great powers don't tolerate rival military alliances on their borders. This wasn't about Vladimir Putin's personality or Russia's political system. It was about structural imperatives that transcend individuals. By 2008, NATO had expanded to include 7 more countries, bringing the alliance to Russia's doorstep in the Baltics. At the Bucharest summit that April, NATO leaders issued a declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, though they didn't provide a timeline. The financial and strategic implications were enormous. Ukraine's 40 million people, its industrial base, its control of the Black Sea coast, and its shared border with Russia made it perhaps the single most important buffer state in European geopolitics. Mearsheimer immediately recognized this as a catastrophic provocation. In a world where great powers compete for security, taking Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and bringing it into a Western military alliance was equivalent to Russia establishing a military pact with Mexico and Canada. No American president would tolerate that scenario regardless of party affiliation, and no Russian leader would tolerate NATO expansion into Ukraine regardless of their political ideology. The first Russian response came in August 2008 when Georgia, emboldened by promises of eventual NATO membership, moved militarily against South Ossetia. Russia invaded, defeated the Georgian military in 5 days, and established de facto control over South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The West condemned Russia's aggression but continued pursuing NATO expansion and European Union association agreements with former Soviet states. The message to Moscow was clear: we're going to keep expanding regardless of your security concerns. Mearsheimer's offensive realism predicted exactly what would happen next. Russia would escalate because the alternative was accepting strategic encirclement. When pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown in February 2014 after refusing to sign an EU association agreement and a pro-Western government took power in Kiev, Russia annexed Crimea within weeks and fomented separatist warfare in eastern Ukraine. The cost to Ukraine was catastrophic: more than 14,000 dead in the Donbas conflict, billions in economic damage, and the loss of Crimea's strategic ports. In September 2014, Mearsheimer published his now legendary article in Foreign Affairs titled "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault." The subtitle was stark: "The Liberal Delusions That Provoked Putin." His argument was simple and devastating. The West, led by the United States, had precipitated the crisis by trying to peel Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence and integrate it into Western institutions. This wasn't a moral judgment about democracy or authoritarianism. It was a structural analysis of how great powers behave when their core security interests are threatened. Mearsheimer wrote that no Russian leader would tolerate Western military forces in Ukraine any more than American leaders tolerated Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war over a threat 1,300 miles from American shores. Yet Washington expected Moscow to accept NATO forces directly on its border without responding. The article generated fierce backlash from the foreign policy establishment, which accused Mearsheimer of excusing aggression and denying Ukrainian agency. But his point wasn't about morality, it was about causality. NATO expansion caused the crisis by threatening Russia's core interests in a way that structural realism predicted would trigger military response. What makes Mearsheimer's analysis so powerful 25 years into the 21st century is that every major prediction he made has materialized. He warned that NATO expansion would lead to conflict with Russia, and it did. He predicted that China would seek regional hegemony in Asia and challenge American primacy, and it has. He argued that the liberal international order would fracture as other great powers refused to accept American dominance, and it's happening before our eyes. When China's economy surpassed $15 trillion and began approaching parity with America's $18 trillion GDP, Beijing didn't embrace liberal democracy as engagement theory predicted. Instead, it became more assertive about territorial claims in the South China Sea, more aggressive in challenging American alliances with Japan and South Korea, and more determined to push U.S. military forces away from its coastline. The Belt and Road Initiative, which has funneled more than $1 trillion into infrastructure projects across 150 countries, isn't just economic development. It's a geopolitical strategy to create Chinese-led economic networks that reduce dependence on American-dominated institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The numbers tell the story of power transition more clearly than any rhetoric. In 2000, the United States accounted for 31% of global GDP, while China represented just 4%. By 2025, America's share had fallen to 24%, while China's had risen to 18%, and the trajectory showed continued convergence. American defense spending, while still massive at over $800 billion annually, no longer guaranteed dominance when China spent nearly $300 billion with lower labor costs and focused regional priorities. The technological gap that once seemed insurmountable had narrowed dramatically. Chinese companies led global markets in telecommunications equipment, solar panels, electric vehicles, and increasingly in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The financial architecture that gave Washington leverage through sanctions and dollar dominance faced challenges from Chinese alternative payment systems, digital currency initiatives, and bilateral trade agreements that bypassed Western banks entirely. Mearsheimer's offensive realism explains why this power transition is so dangerous. When a rising power approaches parity with a declining hegemon, the security dilemma intensifies because both sides have incentives to act while they still can. The declining power fears losing its advantageous position and may be tempted to use force before the gap closes completely. The rising power fears that the hegemon will try to contain or cripple its rise and may be tempted to challenge the status quo before defensive alliances solidify against it. This is the Thucydides trap that scholars have identified in 12 of 16 cases over the past 500 years, where a rising power challenged an established hegemon. Most ended in war. The United States and China are locked in exactly this dynamic, with both sides spending hundreds of billions to prepare for potential conflict over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and broader Indo-Pacific dominance. What nobody in Washington wanted to admit was that the world was building institutions and alliances that explicitly excluded American leadership. The BRICS grouping expanded from 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to include Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, representing 45% of global population and combined GDP exceeding $30 trillion. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization grew to encompass Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and 4 Central Asian republics, creating a Eurasian security bloc that dwarfed NATO in population and increasingly in economic weight. These weren't discussion clubs, they were institutional alternatives to the World Bank, IMF, and Western-led security architecture. The new development bank, established by BRICS nations with initial capital of $100 billion, began financing infrastructure projects without the governance conditions that Western institutions imposed. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded by China with $100 billion in capital and membership from 57 countries, including traditional U.S. allies like Britain and Australia, represented another brick in the wall of post-American global order. Standing here today, watching my students grapple with the implications of American decline, I'm reminded that Mearsheimer's greatest contribution wasn't predicting specific events. It was revealing the structural forces that make those events inevitable. When you understand that the international system is anarchic, that survival is paramount, and that great powers will always compete for dominance, you stop being surprised by Russian aggression in Ukraine, Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, or the Global South's refusal to choose sides in great power competition. You recognize these aren't aberrations or failures of diplomacy, they're expressions of the logic that governs state behavior in anarchy. The tragedy isn't that states are evil, it's that even well-intentioned states are trapped in security dilemmas that push them toward conflict. The cost of maintaining this illusion was staggering. Over $7 trillion spent on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone, according to the Watson Institute's Cost of War project, with minimal strategic gains and catastrophic damage to American credibility. Mearsheimer wrote extensively about how the 2003 Iraq invasion represented everything wrong with liberal hegemony. The belief that America could forcibly export democracy, remake entire societies according to Western values, and face no serious consequences because of its overwhelming power advantage. The neoconservative architects of the Iraq War spent hundreds of billions betting that they could transform the Middle East into a constellation of pro-American democracies, but instead, they destabilized the entire region, empowered Iran, created the conditions for ISIS to emerge, and demonstrated to the world that American power had limits. When you examine Mearsheimer's realist critique alongside his controversial work with Stephen Walt on the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, you see a scholar willing to challenge the sacred cows of American foreign policy regardless of political backlash. That book argued that American policy in the Middle East was driven less by strategic interests and more by domestic political pressure from pro-Israel lobbying groups, costing billions in aid while undermining broader American goals in the region. The firestorm of criticism that followed demonstrated exactly what Mearsheimer and Walt had documented, the extraordinary difficulty of having honest debate about foreign policy when powerful interest groups can label critics as beyond the pale. By the time we reached the 2020s, the structural forces that Mearsheimer identified were reshaping the global landscape in ways that Washington could no longer ignore. China's economy had grown from $3 trillion in 2008 to over $18 trillion by 2024, making it the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. Chinese military modernization, funded by defense budgets approaching $300 billion annually, had transformed the People's Liberation Army from a large but technologically backward force into a sophisticated military capable of contesting American dominance in the Western Pacific. The Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula all became potential flashpoints where Chinese and American interests collided directly, with both sides investing hundreds of billions in military capabilities designed to prevail in high-intensity conflict. Mearsheimer's analysis in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics predicted exactly this trajectory, that China would seek regional hegemony in Asia just as the United States had achieved it in the Western Hemisphere, and that this would bring it into direct competition with American forward presence in the region. The question wasn't whether this competition would occur, but whether it could be managed without catastrophic war. The Trump administration's impact on transatlantic relations exposed another dimension of American decline that Mearsheimer's theory helps explain: the erosion of alliance cohesion when the hegemon becomes unreliable. When President Trump questioned NATO's value, suggested that the United States might not honor Article 5 commitments unless allies spent more on defense, and conducted foreign policy through tariff threats and transactional demands, he accelerated European conversations about strategic autonomy that had been percolating for years. By 2025, European leaders were openly discussing the need to reduce dependence on American security guarantees, with defense budgets across the continent increasing by tens of billions of dollars and new initiatives to develop indigenous military capabilities that didn't rely on U.S. systems. The second Trump administration's policies toward Ukraine, cutting weapons deliveries, pressuring Kyiv to accept territorial concessions, and sending signals that European security was no longer America's primary concern, deepened this crisis of confidence. European officials told researchers that the United States was becoming more a necessary partner than an ally or a friend, and that the breach of trust meant transatlantic relations were unlikely to normalize even after Trump left office. France's long-standing push for European strategic autonomy gained traction in Germany, Poland, and even traditionally Atlanticist countries as leaders recognized that American commitments couldn't be taken for granted. This erosion of alliance trust carries enormous financial and strategic implications. NATO represents military capabilities worth trillions of dollars in combined defense spending, interoperable systems developed over 70 years, and intelligence-sharing relationships that provide force multiplication far beyond individual national capabilities. When allies begin hedging by developing independent capabilities, pursuing separate relationships with China, or simply planning for scenarios where America doesn't come to their defense, the architecture of American global power starts to fracture. Mearsheimer would point out that this is exactly what offensive realism predicts, that alliances are temporary arrangements based on shared threats and converging interests, and when those conditions change or when the leading power becomes unreliable, alliances dissolve or transform. The post-World War II alliance system that undergirded American hegemony cost hundreds of billions to maintain through forward deployments, security assistance, and extended deterrence guarantees, but it provided Washington with influence and leverage that far exceeded the direct costs. As that system weakens, America's ability to shape outcomes globally diminishes accordingly. If you're finding value in this analysis, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future content examining how realist theory explains current events. Activate the notification bell to stay updated, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what city and country you're watching from, because understanding how these dynamics play out differently across regions is crucial to grasping the full picture of power transition. The Global South's rejection of American leadership represents perhaps the most consequential shift in the international system since the end of the Cold War. At the 2025 BRICS Summit in Brazil, with member states now representing 45% of global population and combined GDP exceeding $30 trillion, President Lula explicitly rejected what he called U.S. hegemony and accused Trump of behaving like a modern emperor. The summit showcased both the potential and limitations of alternative power centers. While BRICS nations united in criticizing Western dominance, they remained divided on crucial issues like de-dollarization, with some members more willing to confront Washington directly, while others preferred cautious balancing. What mattered wasn't perfect unity, but the clear signal that large portions of the world were building institutions explicitly designed to function without American approval. The new development bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with its $100 billion in capital and 57 member states, including traditional U.S. allies, and bilateral currency arrangements that bypass the dollar, all represent infrastructure for a post-American financial order. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization's expansion to include major powers like Russia, China, India, Iran, and Pakistan created a Eurasian security bloc that dwarfs NATO in population and increasingly in economic weight. At the 2025 SCO Summit in Tianjin, members discussed deeper integration across security, economic, and technological domains, with plans for development banks and alternative payment systems that would further reduce dependence on Western institutions. These aren't merely symbolic gestures. They represent billions in redirected trade flows, financial transactions outside dollar clearing systems, and security cooperation that doesn't include American participation. Mearsheimer's offensive realism explains this as the natural result of hegemonic overreach. When the dominant power uses its position to punish rivals through sanctions, exclude them from institutions, and threaten their security interests, they respond by building alternative structures. The United States weaponized the dollar, controlled access to SWIFT banking systems worth trillions in transactions, and used its position in institutions like the IMF and World Bank to impose conditions on borrowers. These tools generated short-term leverage but long-term incentives for other powers to create alternatives. Polling data revealed the depth of this global shift in sentiment. By 2024, global favorability toward the United States had experienced dramatic declines even among traditional allies, while China's favorability improved substantially across the global South. Research showed that many countries saw increasing Chinese influence as positive while viewing American influence with skepticism, a complete reversal from the unipolar era. This wasn't just about policy disagreements. It reflected fundamental questions about whose vision of world order served their interests. When Washington lectured developing nations about democracy and human rights while supporting authoritarian allies, conducting drone strikes that killed civilians, and maintaining the world's largest prison population, the hypocrisy undermined American soft power worth billions in diplomatic influence. When the United States criticized China's Belt and Road Initiative while offering no comparable infrastructure investment, Global South leaders asked what America was actually providing besides demands and conditions. China's model, infrastructure investment without governance requirements, trade without lectures, partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than ideology, appealed to countries exhausted by decades of structural adjustment programs and conditional aid. Mearsheimer's framework helps us understand that this isn't about morality or ideology, it's about power and interests. States in the Global South don't necessarily prefer Chinese authoritarianism to American democracy. They prefer autonomy to subordination. They want infrastructure that connects their economies, investment that doesn't come with demands to privatize state enterprises or liberalize capital accounts, and partnerships where they have agency rather than just following Washington's lead. The fact that this preference happens to serve Chinese interests doesn't make it irrational or manipulated. It reflects reasonable calculations about how to maximize their development and security in a multipolar world. When African leaders choose Chinese loans to build railways and ports rather than IMF programs that require austerity and privatization, they're making strategic choices based on their interests, not betraying Western values. When Middle Eastern states maintain relations with both Washington and Beijing rather than choosing sides, they're hedging in an uncertain environment where dependence on any single great power carries risks. The internal dimension of American decline may ultimately prove more consequential than external challenges. Mearsheimer often emphasizes that empires rarely fall from conquest. They collapse from within when they lose the cohesion, resources, and will to maintain their position. By 2025, the United States faced political polarization so severe that basic governance became difficult, with disputes over election integrity, constitutional authority, and the legitimacy of institutions threatening the foundations of democratic stability. Economic inequality reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, with the top 1% controlling wealth that could fund infrastructure investment, education, healthcare, and research that would strengthen national competitiveness. Yet, political gridlock prevented mobilizing those resources effectively. Infrastructure rated D+ by civil engineers, despite being the foundation for economic productivity, worth trillions. Healthcare consumed 18% of GDP, over $4 trillion annually, while leaving millions uninsured and producing worse outcomes than countries spending half as much. Education spending exceeded $700 billion per year but produced declining results in international comparisons. Meanwhile, defense spending approached $900 billion annually, when including intelligence agencies and nuclear weapons programs, consuming resources that could address domestic needs while generating questionable returns. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost $7 trillion without achieving strategic objectives, and the Pentagon budget included waste and inefficiency worth billions that auditors couldn't fully track because the Department of Defense had never passed a comprehensive audit. Mearsheimer's realist perspective suggests that this misallocation of resources weakens America's competitive position more than any external threat. You can't sustain global power when your domestic foundation is crumbling, when citizens lose faith in institutions, when infrastructure falls apart, and when resources flow to unproductive military adventures instead of investments that enhance national strength. The offense realism framework predicts that states maximize power to ensure security, but power ultimately derives from economic dynamism, technological innovation, social cohesion, and institutional effectiveness. When those erode, military spending alone can't compensate. The question facing America today is whether it can adapt to multipolarity or whether it will continue pursuing strategies designed for a unipolar world that no longer exists. Mearsheimer advocates retrenchment, focusing on defending vital interests, avoiding peripheral conflicts, and rebuilding domestic foundations of power. This means accepting that the United States cannot prevent China from achieving regional hegemony in Asia any more than other great powers could prevent American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. It means acknowledging that NATO expansion into Ukraine threatens core Russian security interests in ways that would provoke any great power, regardless of its political system. It means recognizing that the liberal international order served American interests specifically, not universal values, and that other powers won't accept permanent subordination to Washington's rules. These conclusions challenge deeply held beliefs about American exceptionalism, the universality of liberal democracy, and the moral obligation to spread freedom globally. But Mearsheimer argues that clinging to these beliefs while lacking the power to enforce them leads to costly failures and accelerates decline. The tragedy of great power politics isn't that states are inherently evil or that leaders want war. It's that the structure of international anarchy creates security dilemmas that push even well-intentioned actors toward competition and conflict. When you combine these structural pressures with hypernationalism, domestic political incentives that reward toughness over compromise, and the massive destructive potential of modern militaries backed by defense budgets in the hundreds of billions, the risks become catastrophic. The US-China competition over Taiwan, with both sides preparing for potential conflict that could cost millions of lives and trillions in economic damage, exemplifies exactly what Mearsheimer warns about. Neither Washington nor Beijing necessarily wants war, but each side sees the other as threatening vital interests, each builds military capabilities designed to prevail in conflict, and each faces domestic pressures that make backing down politically costly. This is the security dilemma in its purest form. Actions taken for defensive purposes appear threatening to the other side, triggering responses that heighten tensions and increase the probability of the very war both sides want to avoid. Standing here today, watching the international order built over 75 years unravel, I'm struck by how thoroughly Mearsheimer's predictions have been validated. The world has turned against Washington not because of propaganda or misunderstanding, but because the structural forces that govern great power competition reasserted themselves after the anomalous unipolar moment ended. China rose and sought regional dominance exactly as offensive realism predicted. Russia responded to NATO expansion with military force exactly as Mearsheimer warned. The Global South rejected permanent subordination and built alternative institutions exactly as realist theory would expect. American allies began hedging when they couldn't count on Washington's reliability exactly as alliance theory suggests. And the United States, unable to accept that its power was finite and its interests not universal, overextended itself through costly interventions that weakened rather than strengthened its global position. The fall of American dominance has begun, but the story isn't finished. The question now is whether America can adapt to being a great power among others rather than the hegemon, whether it can compete effectively without trying to dominate, and whether it can address the domestic sources of weakness that ultimately matter more than any foreign challenge. Mearsheimer's message isn't despair, it's realism. Understand the structure, accept the constraints, focus resources on vital interests, avoid peripheral conflicts, and rebuild the foundations of national power. The American century may be ending, but that doesn't mean American decline is inevitable if we're willing to learn the lessons that offensive realism teaches. The world has changed, and our strategy must change with it. That's the only path forward in a multipolar world where the tragedy of great power politics will continue playing out, whether we acknowledge it or not.